And we have three outstanding panelists, each of whom is going to give us a 10-minute presentation from their various points of view on the important issues regarding heritage and philanthropy. And then we're going to open it up to discussion with the audience. So we are relying on you very heavily indeed. The heritage sector has, I think, had some difficulty in getting to grips with what one might call the new philanthropy agenda. A lot of people may feel that the recent emphasis on philanthropy is just an attempt to let successive governments off the hook in terms of their declining funding. On the other hand, I think that many will make a robust case saying that philanthropy will be beneficial for our sector because it will significantly increase the sense of public ownership and responsibility. So I hope we're going to talk about that particular issue. We also know that so far, cultural philanthropy in this country is overwhelmingly dedicated to the visual arts and the performing arts, and it is overwhelmingly a London metropolitan phenomenon, which adds further to the difficulties of heritage because our heritage is dispersed all around the country. So raising substantial amounts of philanthropy outside of London and for non-arts projects is extraordinarily difficult. Nonetheless, there have been notable examples of successes, some of which I hope we will hear about this evening. And please share with us your successes or indeed your failures, which may be equally instructive. So we're going to begin with a presentation from Martin Kaufman, who is principal of Martin Kaufman Philanthropy. He has worked on a variety of major projects, most notably leading the fundraising for a major capital project, £20 million at the Museum of London. He also has experience at the London School of Economics, the Architectural Association, and the notable success of the Hackney Empire Theatre. So we will kick off first with Martin Kaufman. Martin.
Thank you very much, Lloyd. Can you all hear me? I'm calling this a debate. And a debate means I can say something controversial. In other words, you might like some, you might not like some. So you may not think it's a debate, Lloyd, but I'm doing a debate. Well, we'll see if other people do that. And why I'm starting off in this way is I'm starting off by saying, first of all, I am proud to be a fundraiser, which is actually the current sort of campaign for the Institute of Fundraising. But I believe I work in one profession with different sectors, each of which has more in common with the other than differences between them. And as such, I believe that heritage organizations are not unique organizations, but absolutely an integral part of what I call the cultural sector. So I believe that art plus heritage equals culture. So tonight, I'm going to be talking about art and heritage rather than heritage. I think heritage has a distinct place, but it's not a unique one within this overarching category of cultural sector. And I'd be very pleased to have a discussion about whether people think later on that it is much more specific. We do lack the clearest statistics about all arts and heritage fundraising. However, we do know both from research and from what I would call anecdotal experience, and I've been in the sector for 24 years, for instance, that arts and heritage have been at the cutting edge of fundraising growth since what I call the paradigm shift, since Margaret Thatcher started to roll back the welfare state and in the process helped to create a fundraising profession. Since the late 1980s, and enormously spurred on by the National Lottery, the cultural sector, arts and heritage, has delivered absolutely exemplary, long-term, sustainable relationships with donors at all levels of giving, but in particular around major gifts and corporate sponsorship and volunteer leadership. Not only has the arts and heritage fundraising sector been very successful, they've actually done things that are much better than the other sectors. So, for instance, in particular, I think compared to the charity sector and the healthcare sector, even with due respect to my next colleague speaking, Nick Blinco from the University of Birmingham in education, what does arts and heritage do that's better than those? Well, I believe that we do the close cultivation and systematic engagement of prospective mid-level and major donors in a fantastic way. We are very, very good at a high quality of stewardship of donors and recognition of their philanthropy. We're extremely good, and I think we're better than anybody else, at family engagement, not only for donors, but in terms of communities, across gender, across ethnicities, across age. All of these things are what I would call the soft moves in fundraising. They're the processes that are absolutely essential for creating good and sustainable relationships, but do not of themselves involve asking for a gift. Looked at, you could say, dispassionately, these soft moves are intended to create the opportunities for prospective donors themselves to ask the cultural organizations, what do you want of me? So these soft moves, of which the cultural sector is so good, are what I call the warm and furry fundraising activities. They're the warm gloves that envelop prospective and existing donors, and which cultural sectors have been better at delivering than any other sector in fundraising. So I'd ask myself, because when I wrote this, I thought, well, why is that? What is the alchemy here? What do we do that other people don't do? Or what do we do better? So I think we are able to combine two precious commodities. They are together creating a bond between supporters and the life of an organization. What we do is, first of all, create the physical attractiveness of being inside stimulating locations. So place is a very important part of the alchemy of cultural fundraising. Secondly, I'd say the emotional impact of direct engagement with art forms and with programs, direct engagement with curators and artists, with storytellers and conservators, where the supporter has a personal interest, we do that better than anybody else. And using this bond between place and emotion, what we can do is get to know our supporters very well and their likes and dislikes, learn the right time to move them on from being low-level supporters to higher-level supporters, pay attention to what they need most so that they will give again, and very importantly, encourage them to leave a bequest so that their own personal commitment can be repeated for future generations. Now, in all due respect, not only to Nick Blinco, but to any charitable organisation in this room, I'm not saying that other organisations don't do these things too. I think in particular the higher education sector is particularly good at donor relations. What I am saying is that these soft moves of fundraising are in the DNA of arts and heritage organisations, and those organisations which have been most successful in fundraising have exploited their soft move potential to the highest degree. However, at the same time, we can learn massively from the other sectors, and there's very, very, very little of this cross-sectoral learning going on. From the charity sector, for example, where in direct marketing and community fundraising and in promotional sponsorship and in cause-related marketing, they're way ahead of the game. They excel in particular what I call the hard moves, which is the direct asks. And looking outside arts and heritage and the charity sector to the education sector, since the campaign for Oxford transformed higher education fundraising from 1988 onwards, higher education has led the field in complex campaigns and the biggest of big gifts, and in particular what I call the ruthless pursuit of improving the level of donor participation. We can learn things there. However, there's one thing above all that we, arts and heritage, and I'll talk to you as largely the heritage side of that, we don't do nearly as well as the other sectors of fundraising. What's that? It is our failure as a sector, as a whole, to publicise effectively enough our charitable case for support. I believe at present all we do is fly our flag at half-mast. to be a bit more brutal, the cultural sector has not made the argument sufficiently rigorously, with sufficient impact, reason, and emotion, that arts and heritage are charitable enterprises essential to the civic, to the psychological, to the environmental, to the social, and the economic future of this country. We've not made the case sufficiently well to most politicians. I will have to say one exception, I think, is the current Secretary of State, Sajid Javid, who he made a wonderful speech in Bristol in the first week of this month, where he emphasised that he was committed to ensuring everyone in the UK has the opportunity to engage with our artists and actors, our history and heritage. Now, many would say, well, we've heard all this before. But I actually think that his particular view as a politician is one that is in tune with my own view of the need to talk about the charitable case of fundraising. Putting government aside, more importantly, we haven't convinced the great British public and donors, and in particular, I'd say the populations of cities, towns, and rural areas where there are cultural and heritage organisations at risk of closing down. We haven't convinced them that we are deserving of charitable funds. For instance, I don't think people tend to think of us as worthy of philanthropic support in the same way as their local hospital, their regional university, their city's orphanage, or even the donkey sanctuary. Now, of course, the cultural sector can never ever hope to compete with the scale and speed of fundraising where there's urgent need, such as with genocide, earthquakes, or even flooding in the Somerset levels. But actually, when people say, well, they're much more important, neither can the university sector, neither can the charity sector, but they still get their charitable case for support across better. Now, since the beginning of a fundraising profession, which is about 30 years old, the other sectors have actually created crystally clear the idea in the public that they are part of a mixed economy in which public funding is ever diminishing, but where the charitable purpose that underlies their existence now requires considerably greater private fundraising if their missions are to be continued. We, however, the cultural sector, we arts and heritage, are constantly having to address the assumption, which is unstated but is implied by government and which surfaces regularly from the public through the media, that arts and heritage are of secondary or even tertiary importance when faced with the need to cut government funding, or worse, that we're completely expendable. Now, this failure of the cultural sector overall to be able to make its case from a moral high ground, like other charities, is not, in my view, substantively alleviated by the many worthwhile and positive initiatives to develop fundraising and charitable profiles, such as the Catalyst Fund and the Arts Fundraising and Philanthropy Programme, and positive campaigns by some government ministers and departments, and what I would call the never-ending public relations from the National Lottery about impact and accessibility, along with the frantic bidding for Arts Council England's funding pot. None of these, in my view, barely dent the surface of prejudice in the absence of a sector-wide, national, publicly supported charitable fundraising case for support. Now, one part of the reason why the fundraising case for supports for arts and heritage is so relatively weak is the enormous diversity of form among arts and heritage cultural organisations. And that's a diversity that covers size and turnover. It covers geographical location. Lloyd has mentioned the overemphasis on London. That's one example. It covers workforce resource. I was quite shocked when Kate Pugh from the Heritage Alliance told me how many members of the Heritage Alliance don't have a staff. Not don't have one person, don't have a staff. There are issues around the diversity of the potential for commercialisation, community links, the ability for organisations to widen access and embrace diversity. Above all, and this is in stark contrast to higher education, the very different funding models which exist not only between each cultural sector form but also within each one. Now, these are real differences. They're not differences that we can just paste over between the fundraising sectors, but what they also reflect and are sustained by one extremely significant fact. In the 30-odd years since the start of the growth of a professional fundraising cadre, there has been no organisation that has spoken up for arts and heritage fundraising as a whole. There has been what I would describe as an historic failure to create and to sustain an organisation that could speak unequivocally for all cultural sector organisations in the same way as the Institute of Fundraising clearly does so for the traditional charity sector, and in the same way as the Council for Advancement and Support of Education, otherwise known as CASE, does so effectively for higher education. And that also arts and business has, in varied times and in varied ways, done for corporate sponsorship in the arts. Because we don't have such an organisation, as a consequence, we haven't had an organisation which could coordinate sharing expertise between the different sectors. We haven't had an organisation which would encourage us to learn from other sectors. We haven't had an organisation which would lobby government, would lobby the National Lottery, the Arts Council, and when appropriate, work together in a very coordinated way with organisations such as the National Museum Directors Council. When it's happened spontaneously, it's happened in an ad hoc way, it's happened in an incomplete way. So, to summarise, without two things, firstly, an effective and publicly understood sector-wide cultural fundraising case for support, and secondly, an effective cultural sector arts and heritage fundraising organisation, we are threatened, in my view, with the closure of many organisations which deserve to survive, and they won't all be the tiny ones. In many ways, I'd say this is a critical time for all. What can we do to rectify these two glaring gaps? Let me first say I think there are some really definitely positive things happening. And so before I talk about what we should do, let's talk about, very briefly, the good things that are happening. We've had, for instance, the recent experience of organisations with donors working together to oppose the cut in higher rate relief. We're seeing the rollout effectively of the capacity and training programs around arts fundraising and philanthropy. And here today, the start of the Giving to Heritage. CASE attracts on a regular basis to its training programs the specialist higher education institutions involved in culture, such as the Royal College of Music, as well as lots of universities that have cultural facilities. Arts and Business has trimmed and retrimmed and now is refocused on sponsorship. I'm delighted that the Prince of Wales Medal for Arts Philanthropy is now entering its 7th year, although it gets startlingly little publicity. On a personal basis, I've been working for 3 years to initiate a project to benchmark fundraising results in arts and heritage organisations, with the spur being the Ross Case Survey in higher education. And I'm delighted that last month our steering group got off the ground. So I hope, touch wood, in 5 years' time we'll actually have a data set which could be used with donors, with organisations, with government to talk about our impact and our results. I'm very glad that there are several important colleagues here tonight from the Institute of Fundraising. And I think the Institute has been moving very fast in this area. I'd say what appears to be a long overdue leadership thrust. So, for instance, it's now committed itself to a 3rd-year cultural sector fundraising conference. And I would like to welcome any of you here today. If you're in London next Monday, the 30th of June, the Institute of Fundraising is having a reception at Somerset House at 5-6 o'clock in the evening to discuss critical issues around cultural sector fundraising. Obviously, the Institute of Fundraising is working with the Heritage Alliance around the Giving to Heritage initiative. It's calling for trustees, I think, for the first time in its new elections to support the cultural sector. There are discussions about setting up an Institute of Fundraising cultural sector group for members, and amazingly and wonderfully, and Paul Marvel can correct me on this in the front row, I believe for the very first time at the Institute of Fundraising's National Convention next week, there is going to be a plenary on cultural sector fundraising given by our chair tonight, Lloyd Grossman. That's all very important stuff. They're encouraging signs. However, I'd like a bit more joined up writing. What I'd like to see is that every organisation which interacts with the arts and heritage sector and who exercise what I call leadership in fundraising should reflect on what I would say is a 5-point plan. Here's my 5 points. We can discuss it later on. First of all, we need to develop an organisation that represents fundraising for the whole of the cultural arts and heritage sector together. Secondly, we need to start an industry-wide and a national debate on the need to define, to clarify and publicise the case for support for fundraising in the cultural sector, which should include donor organisations too. Thirdly, and it's a corollary of that, we need to bring the question of access and outreach and diversity to the centres of the fundraising debate as absolutely essential ways in which arts and culture will thrive and heritage will thrive in 21st century Britain. I'm working as a consultant with Churches Conservation Trust, and that's a critical issue for us. Fourthly, we should ensure an effective process for benchmarking fundraising results. If we don't have that, nobody is comparing anything but apples with pears. And lastly, I think we have to develop much more creative ways of telling stories across the sector and sharing information, sharing data between arts and heritage and the traditional charity sector and education. Ladies and gentlemen, rather than allowing the flag of the cultural sector to continue to fly at half-mast, I am leaving you tonight with a rallying cry. Whether you take it up, whether you want to argue with me, because I like discussions, I like debate, is up to you. This is my rallying cry. This is the end of what I'm going to say. Let's support clarity and unity for arts and heritage. Let's unfurl the fundraising flag for culture. Thank you very much.
Provocative and inspiring. Just as a quick question, the audience, how many of you are fundraisers? How many of you are fund seekers? We might talk about that a little bit later. Wonderful. As Martin mentioned, one of the great successes in terms of philanthropy in this country has been the university sector, who've been spectacularly successful, I think, possibly largely inspired by the success of American higher education. Certainly fundraising is at the heart of higher education at the moment, and I hope we are going to hear a bit about that from our next speaker, Nick Blinco, who is Director of Engagement at the University of Birmingham. Nick.
Good evening, everybody. As Lloyd says, I'm the Director of Engagement at the University of Birmingham, which means I look after fundraising, alumni relations, but also all the engagement with business, particularly with large businesses. Not around sponsorship, but actually around their full and deep engagement with the University of Birmingham. So it's a new model and not one that's used in many other universities. I've run the fundraising office for the last 12 years. And when we started, we had 11 people and we raised £250,000 a year. We're now closing in on finishing our £160 million comprehensive campaign. We now have a staff, including business engagement, of 58 people. And I'm going to come on to pick up Martin's point about the volume of asking and the type of asking. Within our comprehensive campaign, there's all the things you'd expect in a university. So there are scholarships, there are chairs, there are research fellowships. There's also quite a lot of building. But within that building, there are a range of cultural projects that will amount to about £13 million worth of philanthropy that will have made these projects possible. And that includes the refurbishment of the Barrow Institute Concert Hall, the Lapworth Museum that we're hoping to renovate fairly soon, also a whole special collections facility, the completion of the original building at the university, which was, we made a choice. We either had a big clock tower or we finished off the red brick semicircle. And Joseph Chamberlain very thoughtfully thought, well, they're not going to build a clock tower if we wait. So we're going to spend a large amount of money building the largest freestanding, fact for you, largest freestanding clock tower in the world, which can be seen from the M6. It's a terrific emblem for the university, and we're really pleased he did it. It took us 100 years to raise the money to complete the building. So he was right, but even with a man of his vision, perhaps we were probably pushing the envelope a little bit. But that is now the Bramall Music Building, and the clue there is in the Bramall Music Building. So it was funded quite significantly by an individual who is an alumnus but has a real passion for music, and I'll come on to that story in a second. So I think we have a lot of shared things. I think our founding as organisations in many cases came out of that Victorian era. I think our history of philanthropy is very, very similar. So, as Martin said and as Lloyd intimated, there was a period when any significant cultural organisation in the Victorian in the Victorian era would have been funded exclusively by philanthropy because there was no other way of getting it. Now, for a whole range of reasons, so were universities. Most of the universities, certainly of our generation, had that significant Victorian founding vision and significant philanthropy within them. So while we do learn a lot now from the US, actually, well, the way we prefer to position ourselves is we're learning. There is a renaissance of what happened as part of our original foundation. And I would imagine many of your organisations, certainly the larger ones, would have something similar to say about their history. And actually, if you go back into your history, going back to Martin's point about your case for support, there is a very pleasant, particularly as heritage organisations, symmetry to the way you can talk about your organisation. I think we share challenges. There is a very defined, a very confined supporter base. We have 220,000 alumni. Only 1.8% of those give to us. You also will have audiences that you are trying to attract and also that you are trying to approach for funding. Both of us need to attract new wealthy people to us. And both of us need to convince them that our organisations are the sorts of organisations that they should give to. They should part with their very hard-earned cash to support. It's a very crowded marketplace. Martin pointed this out. It isn't just other universities I compete with. Actually, we share very much our fundraising practices amongst universities because we're largely non-competitive. But in this city alone, and Birmingham is a very interesting place to do fundraising, and perhaps that's a conversation point for later, we have a whole range of universities, but also significant cultural organisations, and also relatively modest cultural organisations. Everybody needs that philanthropic support, and everybody can, I believe, make a really strong case for it. I think we share the issue that the public concept of philanthropy is poorly understood, or for the public, the idea of philanthropy is sitting in a bath of beans. It's what you do, it's running a half marathon. And I will come back to this in a second. I think we need to try and explore and exploit what the public believe their responsibility in terms of either fundraising or giving funds to our organisations might be. I think we also share some prerequisites for success. I think all of you need to have a really clear leadership, and you need a leadership that is involved in what you do. I'm fascinated to see the balance between the people who would consider themselves fundraisers and the people who consider themselves seeking funds. I would like to have seen all of your hands up when Lloyd said, are you all, who here is a fundraiser? Because as the chief executive of an organisation, as a leader, most of the people that can make a significant difference to your organisation will want to speak to the CEO. We do a load of asking, and I will come on to that, but in the end, most of the time, the reason that people give is because we give them chance to sit down with a Vice-Chancellor and they hear from him or hear from the leader in an academic field why this is so compelling. So all this it's all very motherhood and apple pie. This is the kind of thing, if you employ Martin will tell you all of these things because he's a consultant. As a practitioner, there are some very, very practical things that I'd like to leave you with. The first thing is, money going into higher education has risen dramatically. So the last Ross Case survey that Martin talks about indicated more £1 million gifts to higher education than any other sector. In 12-13, so the last year we have figures for, £660 million of philanthropy went into higher education in the UK. This is a really, really significant amount of money. And that's an improvement of over 150 million from 11-12. So, I mean, I've been part of fundraising for some heritage and cultural projects, but what I can speak from is my own sector. So, again, I may be at odds with what some of you experience, and also at odds with some colleagues on the panel, and I'm trying to distill 12 years of going into work every day and working really, really hard into something that I can give you in the magic 5 points, which is what my colleague Martin has done. So my first one is that people will give to organisations that solve problems, not organisations that have them. So when you're thinking about your case for support, It is unbelievably uncompelling to moan about how difficult things are. Things probably are difficult. I'm not saying they're not, but don't tell people how difficult they are, because it's not a very exciting thing for people to get involved with. Position and ask as the solution to the challenge, but don't continue to complain about how the government take money away from you. We tried that as a university or as a sector for a long, long time, and oddly, we didn't raise very much money. So we've changed our case for support most of the time and reoriented it almost completely around what people respond to charitably. And we spend a lot of time demonstrating what the impact of giving is. So in our magazine, we used to say, we have raised X amount a year. What we do now is we talk about what people have given and what impact that has had. So it's not how good you are as fundraisers. No one wants to read about how good you are as a fundraiser. What they want to read about is the power of philanthropy. We're also very clear about the projects we accept. So just because a project is brilliant doesn't mean that people will want to give to it. If someone comes to you and says, I've got a brilliant project, you should go and ask people for money for it, the first question should be, and will you give to it? Because if the answer comes back no, then I would just stop the conversation there. So it could still be very important for your organisation, doesn't make it philanthropically compelling. Second point, the reason we raise more money is because we ask more people. So it's really nice that you do the soft, fluffy stuff. You need to ask more people, and you need to be more aggressive about it. I'm not saying that you need to be aggressive all the time, but you need to choose your targets carefully, and you need to be relentless in the pursuit of individuals who can make a difference. We are very, very target-focused. Most universities now have very, very strong fundraising metrics, exactly the same as you would see in CR UK, in the National Trust and various other places. So we really focus on making sure we get out there and ask. And we remove all barriers from our fundraisers. And the one thing I would say, all fundraisers will find a reason to sit behind a desk. If you sit behind a desk, you're not asking people for money. You only need a telephone number and a name. You don't need a load of research. So it's great if you've got a research team, great if you've got a person who can look stuff up on the internet. The main thing is you need to go and start talking to people. Third point, we have a lot of people asking. There are various models, so other models are available. Higher education tends to use the non-volunteer model. So in other words, we pay staff to be good fundraisers, we train them very carefully, and we send them out to talk to people about giving. The volunteer model can be incredibly effective, but it does leave you at the mercy of the volunteers, and it's quite hard to performance manage volunteer, as you may have experience of. We also expect it to cost quite a lot of money. So we expect that will be a cost in what we do. It's a cost that's covered by the university, so every gift, every penny of every gift goes to the projects, but the university covers the cost. We made the case 12 years ago, 13 years ago nearly, that there will be a period where we're not making a lot, so you do need to back us. You need to bear in mind this won't be an overnight sensation. It's not magic, and fundraisers you don't buy a fundraiser who has access to a load of people that you don't already know. What you do if you buy fundraisers is buy a group of people who should be well trained, really focused, and love what they do. It's their job. We've also found one or two people who navigate not just externally brilliantly, but also internally. You will universities are very large organisations, 6,000 staff at the University of Birmingham. They're full of really clever people who like the sound of their own voice. You do need to be a very, very careful and very diplomatically skilled individual to work in those spheres without annoying them. Talk to Mike. Mike knows what it's like. He works there. But you have to be very, very skilled, not just externally, but internally. Fourth point, we take great care of our donors and we really, really listen to them. So we don't spend our time telling people what our problems are. We find out what really rocks a donor's boat or a prospect's boat, and we spend time trying to align that with what we're good at and what we need. So going and pitching doesn't work, or it might, but it doesn't work very often. Going and listening and asking questions and being interested, properly interested in the answer, is absolutely critical. So my example of that is our largest gift this year is £15 million. That started 10 years ago with a donation that came in out of the blue for £10,000. Nothing then for 5 years. Partly because we were trying to work out, how do we work with this person? What is it, this person who will state openly that he doesn't really understand giving, and doesn't really get that much out of it, how do you work with someone like that? And it's taken us this long to get to the point where we found the thing that really lights a fire under him. So again, going back to my point earlier, that if you expect this to work tomorrow, the chances are you might, but you'll be lucky. And actually, if you're going to do this properly, you need to put a significant investment of time and energy and patience into it. When people say no, we explore what they mean. So no does mean no, but no might mean no, not now. No, not that project. No, that's too much. No, some other stuff is happening. So we don't take no as that person's not interested. We take no as the start of another conversation. I'm annoyingly positive. You may well have gathered that. I'm very, very frustrating to work with. We also accept and embrace the fact that wealthy people give to lots of stuff. I used to get really hurt by discovering one of my donors had given to another organisation. And you realize, well, they're kind of grown-ups, aren't they? So they are grown-up people who make very careful decisions about what they do. They work very hard. They're sophisticated. They can cope with quite a lot. They can cope with a whole range of people asking them. It doesn't mean you get less. So think carefully about your potential partnerships. It's something we may go on to discuss. Universities like to see, all of our planning horizons are about here. Universities like to see a symmetrical benefit immediately. I believe that if we work more closely with other partners, but think about benefit accruing over a number of years, if we can get our sights raised a little more, that will benefit universities, and I think it will benefit you if you're working with us. But also, if you're working together, don't necessarily think that everything has to work out for you evenly immediately. And then my final point is that we celebrate the successes with those people who've made it possible. So we eat a lot of cake in my office, and we drink a lot of cups of tea, and we spend time with our donors and make sure our donors get time to spend with students, with staff, with the Vice-Chancellor, whomever they feel they've benefited most. And we really, really celebrate them. So as I said, other models are available. My colleague Martin will be paid large amounts of money to give you the other models. I'm very happy to have conversations with you after this, but I would say fundraising is a fabulous thing to do. Fundraising gives your organisation freedom to do the things you want, not what you're told to do. That's the biggest liberating thing for us, and that's what changed the understanding of fundraising in higher education. That instead of doing what the government told us to, this pound comes in, must be spent on that, we could decide where we wanted to put our funding. That's it for me.
Thank you very much, Nick. Nick, one question that I have, which can't wait, is how do I actually say no to the University of Birmingham and mean it?
It's almost impossible.
Okay.
You can try later if you like.
Our final speaker, Anna Southall, has been on both sides of the philanthropic fence. As Director of the National Museum of Wales, Director of the Museums, Libraries and Archives Council, and also as Chairman of the Barrow Cadbury Trust and as Vice Chair of the Big Lottery Fund. Anna.
Thank you. Sorry, slightly perplexed to find out why, but thank you very much for the glass of water. I now understand what you were doing, why my glass of water was being taken away. Good evening, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here in Birmingham, city of my birth, but more importantly, a city with a great philanthropic history. Interestingly, the same people that donated to relief of poverty, created the schools and universities, the hospitals here in Birmingham, also endowed your art galleries, gave paintings, endowed the buildings. They were really Renaissance men and women. And I think that's something rather sadly that we've lost. They understood that you can relieve poverty, but you need also to nourish the soul. My son once asked me why on earth it was that I didn't do something really important in life, like his friend Adam's mother, who was a doctor and saved lives. At the time, I was married to a television presenter, and I was running, I can't remember what I was doing. I was restoring paintings in the Tate Gallery. I had to think very quickly, but that was my answer. It's all very well and fine, saving lives, but I mean, if we're all doing just saving lives or being saved, the world's going to be a very boring place. I've been asked to talk about incentives for giving in 5 to 10 minutes, which is pretty challenging. I'm also, I have to admit, slightly concerned that many of you are probably doing all of these things that I could think of and doing them very well. So forgive me if you feel that I'm preaching to the converted or even trying to teach my grandparents to suck eggs. I apologise. But it occurred to me that in this increasingly impetitive world, we need to look rather more broadly and rather more imaginatively at the sources of funding. We need to grow that pool of funders that we're befriending, that we're getting close to. It's absolutely the case in my mind that we have not made the case for the importance of our heritage, our access to our heritage. In my mind, this is our heritage, both natural and man-made, so very interesting, isn't it? I mean, we all seem to have a very slightly different take on what heritage might encompass. That's possibly a problem, but in my mind, frankly, heritage is a social justice issue. And by social justice, I suppose I mean the group of people that Martin was referring to as the charities. They're the people that look after young offenders, they're the people that look after people with mental health issues, etc. And I hope that I can explain why I see it as a social justice issue. But first of all, I thought that it might be useful to go through 1 or 2 do's and don'ts that are drawing, there might be 5 of them, I can't remember, that draw on my own experience as a funder and as a seeker of funds. Personally, I would urge you never to undervalue local support, whether it comes in cash or it comes in the giving of skills, giving of time. Those local ambassadors are hugely important to you in a number of ways, not least because you don't know what's in their address books. You don't know who they know. But also because they are very important in providing evidence of community involvement, community engagement. If they don't feel that they own the heritage project that they're supporting, then the sorts of funders that I'm used to working with are going to, I was going to say going to run away, but they're not going to be encouraged. Do ensure, therefore, that you understand and you can meaningfully contribute to the funder's stated objective. This has been said already. Now, that objective could be myriad of things. I mean, it may simply be the intrinsic beauty or merit of the heritage artefact. But I would urge you to look at some of the environmental and social justice funders, many of whom you actually probably know because they fund arts and heritage. Look at the whole range of their funding programs. Look more broadly. I'm not saying that the same trustees necessarily sit on all of those funding committees, but frankly, the staff all work in the same office, and I'll come to the professionalisation of these funders in a moment. The staff work in the same office. These cross-cutting themes, actually, if you can find ways of ticking meaningfully all of those or a range of those boxes, it will help you. Engage appropriately with the funders that you are targeting. This is made much easier in this day and age with a website that nearly always will give you some indication of how they like to work, whether they like to work exclusively through written application or whether they welcome a phone call, a face-to-face meeting, visits, etc. So find out how they like to work. As I say, the sorts of funders that I work with are increasingly professionalised. I would suggest that the years when it depended on whether or not you knew the chairman as to whether or not you got a grant are long since past, and certainly they are in the social justice sector. So the staff know a hell of a lot of stuff. They're really informed about the subject areas that they're funding in, and the trustees rely on them. So yes, I mean, I'm constantly asked by fundraisers whether or not I know this, that and the other person on a trustee board. 9 times out of 10 I don't, but I do know the staff. And I think that's often a missed opportunity. It's also the case that many of the staff of these funders now have fairly considerable delegated authority. I don't know, you may consider £50,000 not worth getting out of bed for. I'm sure that you get out of bed for £50,000. But I know a number of funders where there's delegated authority up to those sorts of levels. Look at things from the funders' end of the telescope. Think about the issues that concern them and think about who they're trying to reach, what sectors of society they're trying to reach, and how you, possibly uniquely in your part of the world, can help them. Think about the value of the project to wider society. Now, some of these values are more obvious. The therapeutic value to memory, mental health, of oral visual handling collections, for instance, or the transfer of skills through young volunteers working with older experts or whatever it is. But some of the benefits are less obvious. The befriending aspects, including actually, oddly, the dispelling of fear on the part of the grown-ups and prejudice on the part of the young people, which was a welcome, but I have to say entirely unanticipated outcome of Big Lottery Fund's intergenerational history project, where we paid for veterans paired with a school child to return to scenes of war. It was fascinating. The children were very bigoted about old age. The veterans, of course, very fearful about young people. It was an extraordinary project. Others are even less obvious, frankly, and I wonder if I could just share a couple of examples from my time at the National Museums in Wales. The Greater Good of Cardiff, I was trying to establish a patrons scheme, and I tempted them into the stores with promises of Monet and Richard Wilson and think of another Welsh artist, Thomas Jones. But what they actually ended up with, to their surprise, was issues of preserving woodlice and the value of sedimentary facies in brachiopods. Really riveting stuff, you might say. But the bug men and women who had collected through the centuries and deposited in that museum woodlice from all over the world had no idea when they collected them that in the 20th century we would be able to isolate and identify DNA. And through this, we would be able to learn so much about how those woodlice had evolved and the causes of that evolution, which were almost exclusively to do with climate and the way in which the climate was changed. So we've been able to contribute to the much, much bigger picture of climate change that, of course, is a significant issue for us today. What of the brachiopods of Gondwana? Well, a not dissimilar story, oddly. I mean, those chaps that chipped out those, in this case, sub-microscopic fossils had no idea that in the middle of the 20th century, scanning electron microscopes would be developed, which would enable those fossils for the very, very first time to be seen. Many of them are intrinsically so beautiful, and they've been a source of great inspiration to a lot of young artists. But more importantly, they have enabled us to fully understand plate tectonics and therefore to work on seismology and predicting seismological events such as earthquakes, etc., with greater accuracy. And the result for the museum? Well, a now growing band of patrons, a very useful source of what I call footloose income, i.e. non-designated funding, as well as a really important army of ambassadors. If I may, I'd just like to share one final example which illustrates the importance of thinking out of the box. The volunteers who were working in Bristol on a steamship, the SS Balmoral, applied, perhaps surprisingly, to the Big Lottery Fund's People's Millions programme. Now, Big Lottery Fund doesn't fund heritage on the face of it. But in fact, what they did was to persuade us of the community involvement, of the fantastic intergenerational exchange of skills, and it was an exchange both ways, excitingly, because the older men taught them all about steam engines and paddle ships and engineering and oily rags, and the kids taught the older men about IT. It was perfect, and it won a £50,000 award. So don't presume that funders like Big Lottery Fund don't fund heritage. We don't fund we're not we anymore, not of a few days ago. They don't fund heritage per se, but they will fund projects where, if you'll forgive me, heritage is the tool, is the means to reach these groups of people. So my final words on motivation, and I think there are 5 actually. What we do look for as funders is well-governed organisations, so organisations with engaged, responsible and appropriately diverse boards of trustees. We look for well-run and business-like organisations. We like to know that chief executives or whoever is responsible understands management accounts, can do adding up and taking away of money. And I have to say, we have noticed that both governance and financial literacy are issues in smaller organisations across the piece, in the charity sector, but also in the arts sector. We like to see organisations that are capable of generating income, so that are enterprising, so that they're not entirely grant reliant. We like evidence, as I've said, of real community involvement. But we also like to see organisations that are ambitious within a realistic and grounded strategic framework. And finally, one that inspires the funder. Somebody else has said this, with its ability to provide opportunities, or provide solutions, I think you said, but certainly provide opportunities for supporting their target groups of beneficiaries and for helping them in tackling the social ills that concerns them. And one final word as I close: nothing beats a visit. If you can get a trustee to visit, great. Get a member of staff to visit, great. But the thing that really does it is hearing the beneficiary, hearing the young man and woman or the older person telling how their involvement with this heritage project has changed their life. That opportunity to speak truth to money or truth to power is very, very powerful.
Well, we certainly have a great deal to discuss. I noticed, by the way, Anna, that you had your 5 points consisted of 6 points.
I added one.
Nick gave us 6 for the price of 5 as well. Martin was more restrained, so we have...
I put down 8 for Nick, actually.
Well, we have a lot of points to discuss. Who would like to begin? I'm concerned, actually, about the case for support. Why you feel the heritage case for support is not a very strong one. Is it because we're stuck with believing what I would call the William Morris case for support, which we've lived with since the 19th century? Namely, it's beautiful, if we lose it, we will be impoverished. Is that no longer good enough for the heritage sector?
It's good enough for some. I actually really believe what Anna says, that heritage is about social justice. I think that in all the organisations that I've worked with effectively, it's the impact on the outside world, whether it's education, whether it's traditional charities or culture, that's really important. And so I think that the whole issue of the case for support is, what does culture do to our society? We live in a society which is completely different to 100 years ago and very different to 50 years ago, and will be even more different in 50 years' time, ethnically, socially, in so many ways. If heritage can't sell itself and the arts can't sell themselves as vital tools for the economic, social, psychological well-being of people, forget it. There'll be a few crumbling ruins, museums that a few people go into, a declining number of organizations. I don't think it's going to happen, but I think that those organizations that don't
address that nature of the case for support. It's impactful, it's outward reaching, it's about society, and I think that's what we lack. And if we could have, for instance, a nationwide debate about the charitable case for support for culture, similar to the issue of legacies, for instance, a legacy campaign, a cultural case for support campaign, to say this is not about toffs at the Royal Opera House. There's nothing wrong with toffs at the Royal Opera House, but it's not about that. It's about, for instance, how music can transform your life and make you happier and more well. It's about how museums are the best way to teach people whose families did not come from this country that they have a history and a stake in the past, in the present, and the future. I think all of those things, I really like the way Anna frames that issue around social justice. That's what our case for support should be about.
Questions from the audience, please. And would you identify yourself when you ask a question, or indeed make an observation? Yes.
Caroline Taylor, I run my own heritage consultancy. Caroline Taylor, I run my own heritage consultancy. One of the things, I've just come from the Association of Independent Museums conference held at the Black Country Living Museum last week. Two things struck me. Case for support was mentioned once by one of the speakers. It was not something that was majored on by any of the lead speakers. The thing that seems to have come into in terms of the museum sector is case for support has been replaced by resilience, and resilience is in entirely a transactional model. You provide resilience through your shop, you provide resilience through generating your own income through visitor fees, but what we didn't really explore was where we start to build that link. Community engagement for museums is critical, but we haven't seen that flow into building an effective case for support. I think Martin has really hit something on the head there, and I think it's a key gap. We have audiences, we engage with them, but we don't see them as whether they're seen as donors or participants in a giving culture. I think that's what we need to encourage more of. But I think you've really hit on a key point there. We're forsaking the nature now is about resilience through trading. It's a worrying way forward, I think.
Thank you very much. And right there in the, someone's racing towards you.
Sam Collinet from Warwickshire. I suppose really just to disagree slightly in that I think that the heritage organisations have a very, very strong idea of the idea of philanthropy from their users. You know, our collections are based on people donating material to us. And actually, we make that case with them when we talk to them about why they should be doing that. So I think we have got a whole body of fundraisers within our organisations just ready to let loose. I can see how on a national stage we haven't made that case, you know, that there is a charitable case for support for museums and for archives and for arts, but locally it's thriving in our collections and the fact that they grow and that we care for them.
Can I comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
I tend to agree with you. I think actually there is an importance in generating the overall case for your sector. I think that's critical. But that's not something that you can do tomorrow when you go back to your offices. I think what you can do much more readily is to start having conversations with your audiences about what might float their boat, what might encourage them to get more involved and potentially to give. And I think actually you'll get much better and more accurate and more helpful strategic differentiation. So you'll be able to talk about what you do that is different from others if you start to have those conversations with your staff and those people who are already coming into your, whether it's a museum or a gallery or whatever it happens to be. And I think there is a danger of, and they did this in higher education a few years ago, of fetishizing a really coherent, overarching case for support. The fact is, actually, most of us as organisations have different needs today from what we had 2 or 3 months, weeks, years, whatever it is ago. And actually that doesn't negate the impact of what those needs are. You just need to talk about them, and you need to find a way of talking about them that makes you slightly different from someone else.
Right there, and then over there. Thank you.
Glynis Powell, AIM Museums and also Museum Development Officer for the West Midlands. Just in terms of the AIM Museum comment, I think actually what's quite interesting about the conference last week, which it was actually entitled Upcycle Your Museum, Making the Most of What You Got, which is why in some ways the emphasis was on resilience rather than perhaps making a case. I think actually historically AIM museums are quite good about making their own case. With my MDO hat on, we're part of Culture What Next, which I think probably some of you know about What Next, the lobbying group. In the West Midlands, it's mainly culture. And there's just one or two museums who are actually going along to that. Me and Compton Verney, who are here today, are one of those, just one of those people. So in some ways, museums need to get involved with some of the other culture. I agree with the speakers there that we kind of separate ourselves. We think we're special. But I'd like to say also that, and heads up for everybody, that Culture What Next in the West Midlands is actually producing a sort of a culture day, 24-hour culture day on the, let me check my notes, the 24th and 25th October, 24 hours, where everybody will, lots of people will be invited to say what culture meant for them on that day, what were they involved with. So we're hoping that we have at least 4,000 to 5,000 people through social media and otherwise actually saying, culture did this with me today, I did this with culture. And I think that might help us kind of create quite a good case for support.
Down on row 3 first, and then row 5 on that side of the room.
Andy Savage, Railway Heritage Trust, but talking outside my job at the moment. I think the different sorts of things that we do in the heritage sector vary very much in their attractiveness. I've been involved in Festiniog Railway these last 40-odd years. We've been running this business since the reign of King William, and we set out to expand it, triple its size roughly, by building a new railway. I was asked to raise 300,000 quid. I launched the appeal, had 150,000 in within 3 days, and eventually raised 3 million over about 2.5 years. And we also got some very big philanthropic donations as well. So when you get the pitch right, it can be very good. I'm also chairman of Avenue House Estate, which is the home of the ink manufacturer Henry Stevens, and when he died in 1918, he left his house and gardens for the public. And it's a much loved park for the people of North London. There were probably 1,000 people in there on Sunday. But actually trying to get people to give money to something like that, and all the points that Nick's made about being positive, don't moan about the fact the council's not giving you any money. I see it as a source of pride that the council doesn't give us any money. But trying to work with people to give us £10 a month or even £5 a month, and it's very, very difficult to sell that in a community that knows what we're doing, that likes what we're doing, but doesn't see why it should put its hand in its pocket to sustain it.
Do you want to just, how do you get people who are used to using things like parks for free, going into churches for free, how do you get them to give regular but often modest support?
First of all, it isn't easy, and nobody's saying it's easy. And going back to briefly what Colinette said, of course there's an enormous amount of effective fundraising going on everywhere. What there isn't is the national story to lobby government and to make sure that we're not right at the bottom of the cuts pile every single time. Going back to, is it Andrew, your comment? At the end of the day, it's about engagement, and it's about a case for support that really resonates with lots of different types of people, and creating a multi-layered structure of engagement So, for instance, Abney Park is in a very affluent or new affluent part of London, Stoke Newington, I think. Finchley? All right. Even better. And I actually think I would slightly disagree with one point that Nick said on research. You need to do, if you haven't already, I'm sure you've done so, you need to do research. So you need to find those 2 or 3 or 5 really well-off people who live nearby or who use it, and you've just got to create that structure. I think that the really important thing is fundraising doesn't come quickly to organisations where there are facilities that have been used for years and years and years, unless you create that impactful case for support, unless you actually engage with people over a period of time and get them involved. I mean, what can I say? This is about creating a fundraising strategy. I think what you don't do is ever rely on just a small number of people giving a small amount of money. I mean, I've seen so many cases of organizations I've worked for that a transformational case for support would transform their view of who they get involved with, as well as the people who are already involved with them.
Councillor Philip Davis, the chair of the Heritage Strategy Group for the city and chair of the Trust and Charities Committee. I'm very interested in the use of the word social justice around the case for philanthropy, and I entirely accept that. But one of the issues about that is universal access is for the vast majority of people in this city, certainly kids in Ladywood and Winson Green, is through free museums and free local events supported on the universal principle by the local authority. Now, the context of any debate about philanthropy has to be that, in my view, you still have to have a degree of universality. Philanthropy cannot replace that any more than it can replace a universal health service. And the problem we face, and we have to accept this, is that there is a fundamental challenge to that principle at the moment, with the city, for example, facing £600 million in cuts over the next few years. Only 40% have gone through so far. Another 60% to come by 2016. Frankly, free libraries, free museums will be falling over. There will be plenty of heritage buildings with a case for needing further work, because there'll be lots of empty buildings of that sort available. And I'm not being alarmist. I'm not waving a shroud here. I'm talking facts. So we have to be aware of that. And this is not to criticise the mixed model of provision. We need paid-for museums. We wouldn't have the think tank in the way it is now. We wouldn't have Ironbridge Gorge museums, which I sat on the board of for 20 years, without having that economic model. So I hope I'm not, I'm not being Luddite in any way about this, but I just want to alert us to that wider picture, because that's the fundamental small p political challenge and big p political challenge that I think we all face. And I think in that context, one of my worries is that we have a very fragmented voice for particularly the heritage, particularly for museums, libraries and archives. And I think it plays partly to what you've been saying, I think, and particularly Mr. Kaufman, about the absence of a focus for organising on behalf of the heritage. I mean, thank heavens we have the Heritage Alliance. Good luck to you with that, because that does part of the job. But I think we do need, certainly in the English regions, to go back to some of the things we used to have, like a regional museums council, like a museums and libraries archive system, which is based on a partnership between local decision makers and businesses and independent museums and so on, because we really have lost that. And London, as we know, is another country. London is fully resourced. London may not feel it is, but you're in a different situation there. The English regions are absolutely impoverished in terms of political clout at the moment. Wales and Scotland are slightly different because of devolution. So fundamentally, any debate about philanthropy, I think, or resourcing has to take place in that context. And I just throw that into the mix, really, for what it's worth. And I would just say, finally, some organisations, funding organisations, have got this right. HLF has a good regional dimension to it with regionally appointed trustees. That is what we need. The Arts Council is terrible We've got some very good people working in the regional office supporting arts and heritage, but we don't have really any effective say. It's seen as a very centralised London organisation, and it wasn't like that. It used to have regional trustees. So there's a big message to send to government there. Look, you need to look at structures, give us the chance to make our voice heard, both working with local government and also in the independent context as museums or libraries or archives.
These are very valuable points. I mean, I think that the dismantling of so many regional structures so quickly has been an absolute disaster.
Anna, do you want to say? I'd like to say something on. That you might want to.
No, go ahead.
Well, I just think that talking from my own profession, because that's all I can do in terms of, I completely agree with the tenor of what you're saying, is that unless we as fundraisers in the cultural sector, and I'm using arts and heritage together, actually have a voice, all we can do is support an organisation here, support a city there, support a municipality there. And again, it's not just London, but it's the national museums that get the best fundraisers because they have the largest resource. So there really, really is a problem about there not being a central organisation to support the cause and professional development of cultural sector fundraisers in order to be able to address this regional lack of balance. So one of the things that I thought was very interesting about what Sajid Javid said was the important emphasis he put on access and diversity, but he also made the point, and I'm not a propagandist for this government, so I just want you to know that, he also made the point that the government has got to consider about the lack of funding for the arts and culture outside London. Now, from a fundraising perspective, I can't do a great deal with regard to the regional museum councils, etc. But I think I can play a part, as can lots of other fundraisers, in ensuring that within a few years, whether it's the Institute of Fundraising taking the lead or somebody else, we can actually have a national lobbying voice at governmental level, at lottery level, at ACE level, on these issues, so that we can support all of you in terms of fundraising, especially in the regions where there's less resource. That's my view.
Anna, you were going to address the observations.
Well, it's a tricky one, isn't it? I can only say that I bitterly regret the passing of a significant number of organisations, which I have had to do with, come to think of it, and the changes that have undone some of the very good initiatives that, and please don't take this as a political statement from me, but very good initiatives that we got through under indeed two previous administrations, so both Labour and the final years of the Tory administration. I think your observation that Wales, Scotland, and indeed even Northern Ireland have profited significantly culturally from devolution is absolutely spot on. And it was very interesting to be working in Wales at the point at which the yes vote went through and to observe the sea change that there was. And in that context, the funding that I managed to secure for universal free admission to museums in Wales was of a significantly greater order proportionately than actually was secured in England. And that was because of huge national pride and because of very local, real community involvement. I don't know what we do. So I rue the day when we lost all of these things, but what we do about it, I'm slightly more exercised by, because frankly, most of these organisations have suffered huge cuts, and these are the ways in which they've chosen to save money. I mean, classically, Arts Council England has had very, very significant cuts to contend with, and even taking lottery money away from Big Lottery Fund and giving it to the Arts Council doesn't seem to have redressed that balance. So I think we need to hang on to what we can, and I think we need at a local level, if you can't do it at a regional level, then work at a local level, so that with a change of administration, those networks, that enthusiasm, that belief in public service within your own region is still there, and therefore we've got fertile ground to work with when things change, politically and or economically. Sorry to be gloomy.
Could I be slightly more optimistic?
Yes, do.
That's unusual. Okay. I think one of the most powerful things that you could do as a sector is to ask the people who give you the large and substantial gifts to help you to do your lobbying. So hearing what Martin said, hearing what you've said too, these people are generally quite powerful. There's a very good reason why many organisations got together to fight the idea that gift aid for the highest rate taxpayers should be removed. There's a very good reason that didn't go through. The reason the government stopped their thinking on that is because most of those people are very influential and they give those parties a lot of money. So there are a lot of people around who will be in your audiences that can help you make those cases incredibly passionately, even down to, I will continue to give if you continue to give that basic level of universal access. So you're talking about philanthropy being about added value. You're not talking about it substituting for what the government choose not to fund or what the local council choose not to fund. They're very, very powerful people. People listen to them because they're rich and because they're very influential. So I think there is something positive that could be done. Again, it won't be overnight, but I think we need to be starting to get your case to the people who can start to make it most effectively.
I've just thought of a social justice coalition where a group of about 25 or more funders of concerned with reform of our prison and criminal justice system got together. They were incensed that the recommendations made by Baroness Causton in her report about the way women offenders are treated in this country, had just been shelved by Jack Straw. And penned an open letter to Jack Straw in the various newspapers, The Guardian, I expect. It had a powerful effect. And I think beyond what those of us that joined together to send this letter had anticipated. And as a consequence, A, we got a meeting with Jack Straw, B, he did a U-turn, and C, the Causton Coalition was born, which is still fighting to change the way in which women, particularly women with children, are treated in our prison system, despite everything that's happening in that sector today, with some success. So you're quite right, the convening power and the pressure of those funders, just a few key names in there was all it needed. Good point.
But that isn't going to be sustainable because there has to be other things. It's absolutely right. It was the key thing for the higher rate tax relief programme.
But the lobbying to make sure that we remain aware of what we've lost through the dismantling of our regional structures was really what I was saying.
Yeah. Oh, one final question. Debbie.
I just wanted to ask you a question about the historic environment. We've talked about everything except for that. And about perhaps some of the historic structures which are not easily reusable in any way. It's quite difficult to make a social justice case for them. If you live where I do, everybody thinks Oxford has a lot of money and my own organisation has a lot of money. And I can tell you stories of the newspaper ringing me up and asking me why we don't buy a building that has just come on the market for £8 million. And the reason, and I said, because we don't have £8 million. And they said, you've got a lot of land.
So
my
which
land,
organisation are you in?
Oxford Preservation Trust. So there's an assumption that we are wealthy, okay? And we're all wealthy and we're all doing these things. So and we haven't talked about it, when they produce culture strategies, we have to remind them that Oxford has buildings which are heritage, which are part of the culture, because they don't think in that way. So it's a two-way street, and how do we engage better with our arts colleagues, if you like, for them to understand that the built environment is, and indeed the natural environment, the views and the dreaming spires, if you like, for people who don't know Oxford, they know that. How do we do that?
Who
wants to?
I'm involved in several conversations, and for instance, the Museum of London, which was not about a beautiful building, but it was about objects that tell stories, and tell stories that, in particular, allow young children in a city which will be soon 50% non-white in ethnic origin, about the history and the civic values that we want them to have in order to have a stable society. So, I do private tours of Oxford. I know Oxford well, but this is about civic values, about, dare I use this word, civilization, and I don't mean it in a class-based way. It's about what we want to bequeath to the future of not just the people in this country, but in the world. So therefore, I just think that, again, this is about looking at the case for support in a completely different way, not just looking at buildings, but about its impact on people's lives. And also there's a very strong commercial side to that in terms of the economy of Oxford. I just don't think that this is about buildings and stones. I think it's about history and the future of our society. Many people think I'm a dreamer on these things, though I like working with organisations like the Church's Conservation Trust to get them thinking in a different way. And do read, actually, Sajid Javid's speech, because it really resonates with me, as it does with certain other organisations, about the type of society that we want to live in, to have heritage as part of that. So what we're talking about is bequeathing to the second half of the 21st century and the 22nd century what we've loved in the 20th and the first part of the 21st century. How are we going to do it? We're not just going to do it by looking transactionally at how these objects, these buildings, these museums look and feel, but what they do both emotionally and politically to people. It's probably not a good enough answer, but that's it.
Absolutely.
Very short point. I've been fascinated listening to this. I've been quiet so far, Nick Quay, because I'm from the private sector, Historic Houses Association, privately owned historic houses. But I'd like to just come in on the back of your point and Debbie's point, because in the private sector, no one is going to, we represent people who own historic houses, no one is going to give us money to keep the place up, per se. They're just not going to do it. And nor is there ever going to be the public finance for that. There used to be a bit in the past, but it's not going to be in the future. So we have to do what you're saying, Martin, but I think there is something that we can share with everyone else here, which is that where we have been successful, it is where we have teamed up with others, and where we have offered, as you have been saying on the panel, we haven't said, come and look at us, we're wonderful, pay for us, give us money through the gate so that we can carry on living in the manner to which we have become accustomed. It is, we are going to give you something which is what you want, and with luck we'll give you something even more than you thought you were paying for, and we're going to do it with others. So I think Debbie and I were at the same meeting earlier this afternoon in Oxford, where we were talking with museums, the university, the tourism, Oxford Tourism, and we've talked with the local enterprise partnership in the past. It's not a substitute for fundraising, but I think it gives us a much stronger case when we go to the fundraisers. So I'm not saying to all the charities here, you shouldn't be supported by government money at all. But on top of that, I think not just talk about within heritage, we have to go and team up with those outside heritage to show that what we're doing is to be enjoyed by others and is relevant not just economically but in the other ways too. But something that I think the private sector can give something there, because I think we've had to do it.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you for that. Thank you all. We're going to continue the discussion over drinks next door.